Hi guys, and welcome to another presentation based on content requested by Patreon subscriber, this time coming from India from Himansu. Himansu asked me about building strength and elasticity for fast bowlers, and today's presentation are my attempts to answer that question. If you have any further questions following the presentation, then please reach out to me and get in touch by your preferred channel. So what we're going to be covering in this presentation. Firstly, I'm going to go over a needs analysis of fast bowling for cricket, what is needed from a strength and conditioning perspective and why that is necessary. I'm then going to discuss my recommended testing battery for cricket and how that assessment can lead you to being able to program exercises specifically to address weaknesses which may be holding you back. And finally, I'm going to finish off with some example sessions based on typically what you find in most cricketers, and finish off with a little bit on the fast bowler, foot and ankle, which I think needs specific consideration given the needs of the sport. Halfway through the presentation, you'll see my face in the bottom right hand corner disappear just while I talk through my example sessions. And just to give a little bit of introduction or bit of background to myself and where this knowledge base comes from. So I've worked for two leading universities in the UK, and I learned from an internship at Durham University, surrounded by 5 of the country's best strength and conditioning coaches, seeing all their university athletes. I've then gone on to do an internship with GB Boxing in the build up to the 2016 Olympics, as well as worked with Paralympic table tennis, and more recently I published my dissertation on change of direction performance in elite youth cricketers whilst I was with Middlesex County Cricket, and also worked both with their first team and gained experience with their under 11s, and have also had experience with both youth cricketers and obviously the professional ranks. So that's my background. I've had lucky enough to have experience from youth athlete, Paralympic, Olympic, professional, and the culmination of my thoughts here come from my masters, my research, and from my practical experience that I've gained coaching. So fast bowling. Fast bowling is a highly explosive action, and there have been studies that have shown that there are upwards of 5.9 times body weight on front foot contact. What that means is, do fast bowlers need to be strong? Absolutely. If you want to tolerate a high amount of bowling workload, you're going to need to have the strength and capacity to be able to have your tissues conditioned to tolerate this load. And in terms of specific movements, obviously you're going to have a lot of movement on one side of the body in particular. And if you look at a joint by joint approach, that suggests that mobility in one area should be then preceded by stability higher up the chain. So for example, in an ideal world, we want mobile ankles, stable knees, mobile hips, stable trunk, mobile spine, and shoulders where it gets really interesting because it's the most mobile joint in the body, but we also need enough stability and strength there to withstand that bowling workload. This means that our strength and conditioning program, we're going to focus heavily on developing strength both in the lower limb, the trunk, and the shoulders. The trunk needs to be able to resist the forces that go through the shoulder, obviously predominantly on one side, and the ability to reactively stiffen up. Full range of motion at the shoulder is obviously going to be important because that's going to affect the position that the bowling arm can get in to relative to other joints. And as soon as we start losing that range of motion, we're either going to compensate with other joints, or we're not going to be able to get into positions that are efficient for effective fast bowling. From a physiological perspective, it's very easy to look at heart rate data and think the heart rate doesn't change that much, but we do need specific considerations from an energy systems perspective as well. Fast bowlers, obviously, by the very nature of the sport, need to be explosive. They need to be able to elastically reproduce energy during their sprinting stride in their run-up phase. Obviously, they're going to need the total body strength to be able to not break down over the course of a training season. They're also going to need power because That's going to determine how obviously powerful they can be in both their running stride and their ball release. Lower limb strength has been shown to be highly correlated to ball release, and this is something that I'm going to talk about in further detail as we get further into this presentation. Finally, injury risk. The fast bowler is the most predominantly injured position. It's been shown that it's been up to 3 times more injuries occur in fast bowlers compared to other positions, which is only to be expected given the explosive and almost violent nature of the heel strike or the foot strike action that occurs during fast bowling. Lack of dorsiflexion. So dorsiflexion is a fancy word for the knee going over the toe. As soon as this ability to move the knee over the toe starts to decrease, fast bowlers not only see an increase in rate of ankle injuries, but also in their lower backs. As I said, when you don't have mobility in one area, that will transfer further up the chain. So dorsiflexion is a key one, and when we get into the fast bowler's foot and ankle, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Stress fractures of the back are also quite common, which is why trunk work needs a very heavy focus when it comes to fast bowlers and all cricketers, to be honest. And there's a scientific and physiological way of doing this in such that we can build qualities, or we can structure our program so that the qualities build on each other rather than just picking random exercises for the sake of it. So what would a cricketing testing battery look like? This is my extensive thoughts on a page, but for me the testing battery needs to cover at least 3 areas, if not 4. So from a mobility, stability and movement quality basis, tests that I like are the overhead squat, just because it gives us a good idea of hip range of motion, shoulder stability, trunk stability, and it's also good for allowing us to find out which muscles are tight and which muscles are weak. However, we are also going to need to, because it's an asymmetrical sport, you bowl on one side unless you're a bit of a freak, although I have seen some fast bowlers who can bowl on both sides, which means that obviously certain muscles on one side are going to tighten up, certain muscles on the other side are going to weaken. Now, that's not necessarily a problem per se, because it's producing performance results in the sport, but if that asymmetry or that difference between left and right sides does get too large, that's when it's a problem. So this is why I like looking at the active straight leg raise, the shoulder mobility test, even bottom up split squats. These 3 tests are all covered in my average to athlete program, which you can download if you're a Patreon subscriber, and that walks you through the assessment yourself. And the reason why I like to look at barefoot versions of squatting patterns is because the foot and ankle is so important to cricket, and tightness or weakness in the foot or calf is going to limit your ability to be elastic and explosive, and for you to absorb and produce force the way you need to. Now, this is why stuff like single leg calf raises are a good indicator of that foundation of qualities we need to be elastic. If, for example, you score poorly in the single leg calf raise, it's very hard to be explosive if you don't have that foundation. And other tests which perhaps aren't as important, but definitely still worthwhile doing if you're serious about improving your cricket performance, are basic capacity tests of the glutes, hamstrings, and quadriceps. And going back onto the trunk training, one-legged side plank was a test we used at Middlesex quite frequently. One of the physios did his masters on this, and the reason why they used a one-legged version is because they found that all the players were acing the side plank test with obviously 2 feet as it's regularly performed, yet some players were getting injured and some players weren't, and they couldn't work out why this was. The one-legged side plank doesn't just look at the core musculature, it looks at the entire sling system. So the body isn't just a random arrangement of muscles, we are made up of sling systems. So for example, if you were to look at the anatomy of the body, the left shoulder is connected to the right hip via almost a crisscrossing of movement patterns. This is why I say when you look at those tests that test one side compared to the other, this is where we can be really specific with exercise prescription. Just to show you a quick example, so I come from my sport back in the day was boxing. Now if I just look at my left and right arms, so if I try and turn side onto the camera, you'll notice that my left arm I'm missing some mobility on my left-hand side. If we just tested movements using both sides, it'd be very difficult to see what the differences are there. So that's why for me, fast bowlers should be using a lot of single side training in order to help not necessarily reduce these asymmetries, but just get them to a level where you can still function and it's not an injury risk. Although there are studies that disagree with this, 10% has been touted as a figure in terms of when you go over 10%, that's when it's perhaps some studies have said that it might increase injury risk. Now let's look at strength and power. So from a lower body perspective, that is what's going to underpin a lot of the power you can produce in your running stride. And also if you're going to be, for example, recovering in between test matches, for example, then having better strength and being better conditioned is going to help that recovery improve a lot quicker. For example, there's research papers which show that, yes, it's in football, but the trap bar, having a higher 3RM of a trap bar deadlift significantly predicted players' ability to recover much faster. Now, I'm not saying go out tomorrow and test your 5-rep max, but what I am saying is this figure can give us an indicator of general robustness, strength, and how well it's underpinning your power. So the reason why the jumping assessments are important, especially the triple single leg hop and the triple standing long jump or long hop, is because this is an indicator of how well you're using that elasticity of your foot and ankle. So for example, if you were to perform a single leg hop and hold, this is assessing your body's ability to produce and absorb force. So when you land, I'm not just looking at how far you've traveled, but I'm looking at how you've got there. For example, does the knee buckle on landing? Or is it a nice, smooth, balanced and stable landing? Looking at the triple standing long hop, in an ideal world, your triple standing long hop should be more than 3 times your single leg hop and hold. So let's say, for example, I'm just going to use these numbers for the sake of easy maths. I'm not saying this is what you should be aiming for, but let's say you can hop and hold 1 meter on your left leg. If you were to do a single leg hop and hold, and by the way, that's boing, 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 not hop, hold, wait, hop, hold, wait, hop, hold, wait. So it's 3 consecutive, nice and quickly, and your ability to still nail that landing. You'd want the triple to be more than 3 times the single leg hop and hold. And if it is, that's a good sign you're using your calf elasticity well. If it's lower, that's a suggestion that you're not very well trained in terms of reproducing that force, and we need to look at stuff like plyometric variations in order to improve that. And it's also good to use a standing long jump and a standing triple long jump just to see where your force production capabilities are at. Now, if you have access to timing gates, even better, just because this test won't be super accurate if you're doing hand timed, but having an idea of your 20-meter sprint time is going to be useful as well, because obviously you're going to be taking in more momentum into your delivery. However, obviously it's important to make sure you're working alongside a technical coach, because it's, for example, I would argue that from a physical perspective, I would be miles clear of all of these tests. Doesn't automatically mean I'm going to be an excellent fast bowler if no one's ever taught me how to best fast bowl given the constraints of my body. A final test I like is a 6 times 20 meter sprint with 20-second rest in between. What that's going to show us is not just how explosive you are, but whether or not you are repeatedly explosive. Because if you do one 20-meter sprint and you haven't got an effective base of conditioning to repeat that, then you're not going to be much use as your matches wear on. And finally, cardiovascular endurance. There's loads of different cardiovascular tests you can do, so I'm not going to get into that here because I don't think it's the most important test in terms of improving your strength and elasticity, but resting heart rate is a good one in terms of looking at your recoverability. If it's below 60, you're probably doing a good job. Now what I'm going to do is turn the video camera off just whilst we dive into some example sessions. So this is an introduction to how I would look at training for a fast bowler. So what's key to notice is that there are phases of training, and this for me would be from phase 1. For this phase, I'm assuming that we have an athlete who has never performed strength and conditioning that has been prescribed by a strength and conditioning coach, and as a United Kingdom strength and conditioning accredited coach, this is what I would recommend. So in the plyometric exercises, these are our jumping and repeated jumping variations. So all we're looking at in this first phase with these plyometrics is the body's ability to absorb force, both on a single leg with our single leg horizontal hop and holds, and on a double leg with our altitude landings. So here I'm not concerned about how far the athlete gets with their jumping and hopping variations. What I am concerned with is the stability when they land. Are they landing with their knee in line with their toe? Are they sinking back into the hips to absorb the force? Or are they landing and they're a bit wobbly and they can't demonstrate an ability to absorb force? Now, the better your body is at absorbing force, so that's the body's ability to brake, the faster your body will let you run. If your body knows you could potentially hurt yourself because you haven't got the strength and stability to land well, then how fast it's going to let you run in your run up is going to be limited. So the aim of the plyometric, the first phase from a plyometric perspective, is to improve the ability to land well. From a trunk perspective, so trunk is the name I give from everything between the knees and the neck, we're simply looking at the body's ability to stabilize and resist unwanted movement in a low force environment. So typically these are going to be these exercises of slightly higher volume, and we're looking for minimal recovery between efforts, because we're seeing we're looking at the trunk's ability to resist unwanted movement, but the movements aren't that much high forces. What I want you to think about is when you're bowling, if you've got poorly conditioned trunk musculature, so it's not strong, it's not stable, then you are leaking energy in your run up and your delivery. From a strength perspective, we're using lighter weights in this phase because we're simply learning basic techniques. So one way I like to do this, especially if I'm working with an athlete where lifting is not their sport, so cricket, you're doing these exercises to improve your fast bowling ability. You're not necessarily doing them because you, for example, like doing them, as it were. So by using movements such as the goblet squat or the dumbbell RDL, we can learn the techniques with lighter weights, and we can use these in our warm-up. So for example, improving our hip mobility with the goblet squat, our hamstring mobility with the RDLs, and what that's going to do is that's going to put us in a position to use more weight and get stronger and more powerful in subsequent blocks. So I'll be running this block for about 4 weeks before I'd be looking to move on to the next phase. So we've got movements to improve shoulder health and shoulder stability, as well as improving our technique with lower body movements and giving us the foundation of mobility that's going to help us when we start to load the body more. I'm also a fan of single arm work when it comes to pushing patterns, just because obviously in fast bowling you're going to find you're probably stronger with one side. So by using single arm variations, we can let the other side catch up to a certain extent. Kettlebells also allow the shoulders to move in more natural planes of motion, rather than, for example, fixing them to a barbell, where you might see one side take over a little bit more than the others, or you can't quite get that range of motion because you're limited by the actual bar itself. By developing shoulder stability and strength in overhead positions, particularly with a single arm, that should support any improvements in lower body strength and power, and the ability for us to produce force throughout the entire kinetic chain of the body. The kinetic chain is just a fancy way of explaining how we produce force from our feet and eventually leads to our hands, which eventually leads into the release of the ball. So in the trunk stuff, we're looking to resist movement in this initial phase. Now this is what phase 2 would look like. So from a plyometric perspective, we've gone from looking at our ankles, hip and knees ability to absorb force, and now we're looking to produce it. So we've worked on the brakes, and now we're going to put our foot on the gas a little bit. So you should also notice that certain movements which we were doing in the warm-up are now loaded a little bit more. So for example, the dumbbell RDL that we were doing in the previous block, that should give us the technique to then perform something like a trap bar deadlift. So by improving the strength of the glutes and the hamstrings, these are muscles on the back of the body, that's going to give us that underpinning to improve our power. The posterior chain I also call the performance chain, because you're going to struggle to find an athlete with strong hamstrings and strong glutes who isn't fast and explosive. And we're also still looking to further develop our stability and range of motion in a single leg. So we've gone from split squats to a rear foot elevated split squat. So that's going to demand more range of motion, and it's giving you more movement options to cope with. And we've also looked at increasing the demand on the trunk. So we've gone from what I would call stability exercises, where we're looking to focus on postural control with low forces, and now we're looking at the ability of the trunk musculature to resist high forces. So now we're adding a weighted side plank and seeing if we can prevent our body from collapsing. We're also looking at heavy suitcase carries. When you've got a heavy dumbbell in one hand for a suitcase carry, one side of your core has to work really hard to stop you being pulled off balance. And for me, this is developing similar qualities that we're going to need in fast bowling. Again, there's an explosive action going on one side of the body. We need to make sure we have the stability, strength, and the stiffness in our trunk to resist over rotation, to resist falling away to the side too much. And we want to make sure that we're improving general shoulder robustness. And finally, this is what the final phase for me would look like. So we've gone from absorbing force in phase 1 to producing it in phase 2 to now we're producing it repeatedly. So in order to sprint fast, which is going to impact your delivery, we need ankles that are like springs. But first, we have to get them stable. And that's why we're now looking at repeated jumps. So for example, a triple standing long jump would be boing, 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 and a triple single leg hop, again, boing, boing, boing. We're not looking to pause in between each rep. We're looking to be nice and explosive and trying to get off the floor as quickly as possible. You should also notice that we now have more jumping exercises in the form of squat jumps and trap bar jumps. Now we've developed a bit of strength through the first 2 phases as well as technique. We can now afford to be more explosive with our exercises to improve our lower body power. So the difference between squat jumps and, for example, normal squats is that in normal squats there'll be a deceleration phase just by the sheer fact that you're slowing the movement down as you're at certain points. With squat jumps and trap bar deadlift jumps, you're looking to explode up and continue to accelerate. And we've still got our elements like our goblet squats and our warm-up to make sure we're still touching upon our squatting technique. And finally, with the trunk musculature, we're looking to develop elasticity. So this is the ability of the trunk to stiffen up and to remain solid when we're performing explosive actions. I quite like using medicine ball throws for cricketers, but they have to have the underpinning stability and strength. Obviously, cricketers by very nature do a lot of explosive work. So if you're in season, the explosive work would need to be regulated in relation to how much explosive throwing you're doing just by nature of your actual cricket training itself. So you can see we've gone from a largely stability or capacity focused in session 1 whilst learning basic in phase 1. We've gone to building strength in phase 2 to then converting it to power in phase 3. So you should see how those qualities help support each other. If we went to power straight away in phase 1, we might not have the stability to cope with that, and that's where we're going to lead ourselves to an increased injury risk. Now I'm going to talk about specific considerations for the fast bowler's foot and ankle. As I said, research has shown, and I'm sure there's more research to show the forces are even higher as athletes become more explosive, but there's at least 5.9 times body weight going through that front foot on front foot contact in our delivery. So this is how I look at training the foot and ankle for a fast bowler. Now, what's important to note is it's not necessarily that you need one before the other, but this is just going to determine how much of your foot and ankle training should be dedicated to what quality. So with mobility and stability, that's just, can your foot and ankle get in the right positions in the first place, or do you have the ability to get in those positions? Just because you have the mobility and stability to get in them does not mean that you will. What I mean by that is the mobility and stability, that's your, for example, your work with your physical preparation coach or your strength and conditioning coach. And if you can demonstrate you can get there in, for example, the screening as I'm about to tell you, but you don't actually get there, then it lies with the technical coach. However, if you can't get there in the first place, you can do all the coaching in the world and you can't cue someone into a better position if they physically cannot get in there. So mobility and stability, the first test that I would be looking at is something called a knee to wall. So it's very simple. You can YouTube it if you want to. I'll drop a video at a later date. But if you have a tape measure, use a tape measure. If not, use a fist distance. It's not obviously as accurate, but if you're failing from a fist distance, that's a big red flag. Basically, you're going to line up in a half kneeling position in front of the wall. You're going to put your tape measure or your fist in between your big toe and the wall, and you're seeing whether your knee can glide effortlessly to the wall without that heel coming up. If that heel comes up, then you have restrictions in your calf musculature that will need taking care of. So the knee to wall test, interestingly, a paper I was looking at this morning found that when they compared cricketers when they had ankle range of 12 to 14 centimeters to cricketers above 14 centimeters, and those with ankle range of above 14 centimeters suffered less back injuries. Now, you'll be surprised when you test 12 centimeters is still an impressive distance. Anything less than 10, you're probably going to be struggling because you'll be leaking energy, you'll be transferring force to the knees, which is going to increase the risk of knee injuries, you'll be transferring force to the back, which again, with the explosive action of bowling, is going to transfer forces there, and you're just increasing your injury risk. Now, if you add all this on top of not having a strength base, you're going to be in big trouble pretty soon. Another exercise I like for just building that mobility and stability is called a heel toe walk. So basically you do this barefoot, but if this is the ground, you're going to land on your heel, rise up as high as you can on your toe, hold that position for a second or two, and then continue to walk. You can start this double leg and eventually progress to a single leg. Next off is capacity. So this type of foot and ankle conditioning is going to be low force, so typically using just your own body weight, and low speed and high volume. You're going to do lots and lots of reps. So single leg calf raises, I've already mentioned that they're a test that I would use. If you can't score 25 reps on a single leg calf raise, then calf capacity is something you need to improve. And another coaching tip, important to mention that when you're doing these, pushing through the big toe and making sure that your ankle is not falling out either side. If you find that you're not able to push through the big toe, you won't be using that calf muscle properly, and equally you're probably going to be at risk of a lateral ankle sprain. And like I said, you're going to smash these in high volume, so anything from 20 plus reps. At Middlesex we use sets as high as 50, which if you're a running based athlete watching this is definitely worth doing, just for giving you that base to then do more explosive jumping work in order to make sure your foot and ankle can actually tolerate this. Then we move on to strength-based exercises. So these are high force, lower volume. So what I mean by that is we're going to be using weighted exercise. So if you've got access to a leg press, just using a leg press calf raise is good. Equally, if you've got, for example, a 20 kilo plate and you're in a seated position, putting it on your lap and then just raising your calf. So we need to make sure we're strengthening the calf both in bent knee positions and in straight-legged positions, because this is targeting different the different calf muscles, and it's also just building all-round robustness, which by building that strength and building our springs in our ankles is going to help with our sprinting. Isometrics are also useful. So for example, loading a weight that you really have to work hard to resist for 5 seconds, and then obviously you can put 2 feet on and relax. So when we're sprinting, the calf muscles do work isometrically, which is basically in static positions, and eccentrically, so they're trying to resist the high forces. We've already mentioned 5.9 times body weight, as well as concentrically. Finally, once we've done all that, we get on to our rate of activation. So power would be an appropriate word for this as well. So this is high force, high speed, low volume. So this is going to be stuff like pogos, which I can do a video on later, or you can YouTube, and actual sprinting. I know like it kind of sounds too obvious, but a lot of fast bowlers don't spend time improving their actual ability to sprint. Now, I've just covered an example of a gym-based program, but in reality, you need to be sprinting 1 to 2 times a week at least at full speed. Something like a 30-meter sprint, rest for 2 to 3 minutes. Yes, you do need that long if you're generally trying to improve speed, and repeating that 2 or 3 more times, obviously making sure you've got a thorough warm-up. And equally, if you can skipping rope, but something like double unders. Again, YouTube them. That's when you're looking to jump twice before the rope hits the floor. Sorry, you're going to struggle not to be springy if you can perform double unders well. So, my key take homes. I appreciate if you've listened this far. Turn your ankles into springs. It's no good building all the strength in the lower limb if your ankle is spongy when it hits the floor. That ankle needs to be springing you back up and providing you free energy. When you use plyometric training and when you develop stiffness in your ankle, and when I say stiffness, I mean that springy ability, not like a lack of flexibility. Develop that stiffness, and your ankles will thank you for it, because you are getting free energy, because the elasticity that I previously mentioned is a result of the tendon being able to stretch and recoil, much like a rubber band. If you're developing strength, use whole body movement patterns. So that's why you'll notice there wasn't much isolated work. And if you're obviously, the sets and reps will differ whether you're on season or off season, but whole body movements are going to give you the biggest return on investment. The body is one piece. As I said, with those sling systems, the body is not separate component parts, and what you do with one part of the body will impact what happens at another part of the body. And finally, when it comes to your plyometric and strength program, train to resist force, so that's landing well, so make sure the brakes work before you start focusing on more intense jumping exercises. Develop your ability to produce force, so this looks like strength training. We're looking at lower reps and resting plenty between sets. And finally, producing force quickly. So these are your jumping variations, your sprinting variations, anything that's going to force you to move quickly is going to be useful here. And ideally doing your plyometric variations as you get more and more developed in terms of that foot and ankle. These can begin to look a little bit more like cricket. And as I said, with the trunk stuff, we go from stuff that's looks very basic, focusing on postural control, to eventually developing strength with heavier loads, to eventually being explosive by throwing medicine balls. Hope you found this useful. If you have any further comments, then please do get in touch by your channel. Todd Davidson, P2P Coaching, and thank you once again for requesting content. Happy to do another one of these videos for any Patreon subscribers. Thanks guys, catch you in the next video.